This Bible lesson, number 9, is called cross-examination for double meaning, basically. One being we're going to examine whether Jesus rose from the dead, and also we're going to examine it by the legal method of cross-examination. Most people would accept that if you have a fair amount of evidence against someone in a court of law, that you don't just walk in and present your stuff and ask for a judgment. You have what's called cross-examination, where the prosecution will say what the case is against the defendant, and then the defense attorney will come up and present an opening remark or whatever defending that person that's on trial. And they don't stop there, though. That will go back and forth many times until everyone is satisfied that the evidence pro or con has been discussed and that it's time to reach a verdict. And this is unfortunately not practiced enough when people want to investigate other things in life that isn't in a court of law but deserves the same kind of care. And this is no less true, of course, than when you examine the Bible and the life of Jesus and whether the core claim about him is true, that being that he rose from the dead. This is the crux, literally, of the Christian faith. Without that, Jesus is just another religious leader, and the Bible is just another book. So, we're going to look today at the evidence for the Bible itself. I have already done a video on the Bible canon, and so you will be familiar with this page that I hopefully am showing right now from my archive blog. But today we're going to look at one in particular, this one called Testimony of the Evangelists. Okay, so that's this one here. I hope you can see that. And this is the title of a document by someone named Simon Greenleaf, who lived 1783 to 1853. So the language in this document is going to be somewhat archaic sounding. He was, as it says here at the top, one of the principal founders of the Harvard Law School, originally set out to disprove the Bible testimony concerning the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He was certain that a careful examination of the internal witness of the Gospels would dispel all the myths at the heart of Christianity. But this legal scholar came to the conclusion that the witnesses were reliable and that the resurrection did in fact happen. So this is forensic evidence. This is legal evidence. And this person who was teaching law to students at Harvard during that time period, when he was adult, of course, during that time period, and was challenged by his students to apply his legal methods to the Bible and the resurrection. So his motivation in this pursuit was to disprove it. That is to say, he was the prosecuting attorney finding Jesus guilty of not rising from the dead. He wanted to destroy Christianity. That was his motive. So no one can say that he had confirmation bias. That is to say, he wished to find it true. He did not. He was a hostile witness, so to speak. And so for him to be convinced by the evidence is certainly something to consider. Now, as I've said before, if you don't hold that anything in the past can be true or reliable for any reason, then you can make up whatever you want, and making claims about the past is just fantasy, because you have absolutely no way to tell truth from falsehood or real from fake. And if you have any kind of a standard on how you can examine things and make inferences about the past, then you have to decide what those are before you start your investigation, or you are in fact engaging in confirmation bias and not being open-minded. And that's basically the opening paragraph here of this document. And as we'll see later on, let me see if I still have that highlighted down below here. Try not to get dizzy. There it is. This is the basis that I'll go back and look at those paragraphs, but He says the credit due to the testimony of witnesses depends upon, firstly, their honesty, secondly, their ability, thirdly, their number and the consistency of their testimony, fourthly, the conformity of their testimony with experience, and fifthly, the coincidence of their testimony with collateral circumstances. So these are the 5 criteria he will use as a lawyer to examine the truth or falsehood of the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. So now we're going to go back, and what I want to do is just kind of, I could sit here and read the paragraphs. I don't want to do that. I will try to summarize, and if my summary is inaccurate, you can see it well enough here. You can read it yourself. So I'm going to get started on that now, and hopefully it, I have not read every word in this document, but I've read it before a long time ago. So I may be, hesitating here and there, but as I said, you can read it yourself. Okay, he begins by establishing the point that a person investigating something like this must be open-minded, and he defines open-mindedness to follow the truth wherever it leads. And this is something a lot of people claim, but fewer people do. They're not ready to accept the truth wherever it leads. As I've said before in other venues, a lot of people want to pursue the truth, but they really don't want to catch it. They don't want to go where it leads. They just enjoy the hunt. They don't want to actually catch what they're hunting for. And then he explains that he uses the word docility, and what he means is, as he explains, not a spirit of servility or the surrender of reason and judgment to whatever the teacher may inculcate, which is teach and try to get into your head, but it is a mind free from all pride of opinion, not hostile to the truth sought for, willing to pursue the inquiry and impartially to weigh the arguments and evidence, and to acquiesce in the judgment of right reason. So he's saying that you should not have a preconceived conclusion you're driving to. Even though he himself had one, he expected to find that Jesus did not rise from the dead. But in spite of that, he did, to the best of his ability, remain open-minded that he could be wrong. That's the key. If you're not willing to say you could be wrong, or you're not willing to say that you have anything else to learn in life, then you are not open-minded, you're closed-minded. And he goes on to say the investigation should be pursued with seriousness, matching the subject. I mean, there are some things, like if you're discussing the plot of a TV show, you don't need to be as vigilant or diligent as you would be to something that affects all of life, such as the Bible does, because that's the scope of its writing, and it's meant to be a serious writing, not fiction. Regardless of what people may think of it, that was not its written intent. So he is saying that if you're going to investigate this subject, you better be careful and diligent and do your homework and take your time, because of the consequences of the conclusion you will reach. So then in the second paragraph, he says that Christianity demands nothing more than is readily conceded to every branch of human science. That is to say, we should not change the standards of investigation just because this is the Bible. And that door swings both ways. You should neither lightly dismiss and be careless and sloppy with your investigation as you should be to study anything else that's of serious consequence, such as the shape and size of the universe or things like that. So the standards are the same. An investigation done with rationality and care is what this kind of topic demands. As he goes on to say about human science, all of these have their data and their axioms. An axiom is a presumption held by faith, really, or personal preference, whatever you want to call it. And Christianity, too, has her first principles, the admission of which is essential to any real progress in knowledge. And then he goes on to quote someone named Bishop Wilson, who just says that Christianity says that you must enter the kingdom of God as a little child. And of course by that nobody means too simplistically. It just means you go in without prejudice. A child will believe what you tell them, but in this case what we want to be told by is the truth and the evidence. And like a child, not decide beforehand what the answers will be to the questions we're asking. And he goes on to say, Christianity does not profess to convince the perverse and headstrong, to bring irresistible evidence to the daring and profane, to vanquish the proud scorner, and afford evidences from which the careless and perverse cannot possibly escape. This might go to destroy man's responsibility. All that Christianity professes is to propose such evidence as may satisfy the meek, the tractable, the candid, and the serious inquirer. So in other words, if you are dead set against finding anything true about the Bible or the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, then don't waste your time. There's no point in examining it, unless you want to fool people and say, see, I did an examination of this and I found it to be a bunch of fairy tales, when in fact you've done no such thing. Most people's idea of examination is very shallow, very much based on prejudice beforehand. They read what they wanted to find, and they accepted things not on the basis of any objective standard, as I've mentioned in earlier videos, but on the basis of their preconceived ideas of what they wish to find. And so they collect all the evidence in favor of their foregone conclusion. And they accuse us of doing the same thing, which is quite a double standard, and another video I did on double standards. So it's important to understand what it really means to be open-minded and to examine something carefully. So he goes on to say in the next paragraph that his purpose is not to enter upon any general examination of the evidence, upon any general examination of evidence of Christianity, but to confine the inquiry to the testimony of the four evangelists. In other words, he's going to just look at the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are the called the Gospels. It's the same meaning as evangel, which is good news. Okay, so they're both reporting an event in history. That's what the Gospels are about, reporting an event in history and chronicling the life of Jesus, what led up to all of what he did and what followed, and everything in between. So he's saying that he's not examining the entire Bible here, or the entire set of Christianity's claims. What he's doing is a very specific point, and that's important in any debate. In a real debate, as opposed to most of what is called debate online these days, you have a very specific point that makes a claim, and you have one person arguing for what's called the affirmative, which is supporting that claim, and another person arguing for the negative, which is challenging that claim. And then each person takes turns with opening remarks, a presentation of their primary argument, and then a rebuttal to each other's statements, and then a conclusion of each. And in a real debate, it is not the debate participants or the moderator of the debate that decides who won. There is no declaration of a winner. That is made by each individual in the observing audience of a debate. Each of them decides who won. That's the purpose of a debate. And the best debates are done by people who absolutely are bent on disproving each other and not open-minded at all. So because what that means is that they're highly motivated to poke holes in each other's weaknesses in their arguments and in their claims. That's what a real debate is. But what's going on here is not, in this document, a debate. It's an examination. And so the examiner must not be prejudiced. They must be open-minded. And so the thing that's in common with a debate here is the specific point. That is to say, don't get too far off track with things. Only bring in what's necessary and relevant to the point that is under examination here. So he's focusing on the four Gospels. The foundation, as he says, of our religion. By this time, of course, he's writing as a Christian, which he did not expect to become. is a basis of fact, the fact of the birth, ministry, miracles, death, and resurrection by the evangelists as having actually occurred with their own personal knowledge. So he is examining the eyewitness testimony of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So the Christian faith rests on the credit due to these witnesses. Are they worthy of implicit belief in the matters of which they relate? This is the question in all human tribunals in regard to persons testifying before them, and we propose to test the veracity of these witnesses by the same rules and means which are then there employed. In other words, once again, we're not using different standards for or against the Bible than we would use for anything else. So the character of the witnesses is very, very important, as per that quote that I highlighted and read earlier. So he goes on to say, it is still the evidence of matters of fact capable of being seen and known and related, which is to say we're going to have something concrete to look at, as well as one person against another. And he doesn't, in this time period, people used man very much more generically, meaning people, mankind, human beings. Okay, so we're talking about evidence that can be examined as, for the Bible, as anything else. And he goes on, if the testimony of the evangelist, supposing it to be relevant and material to the issue in a question of property or personal right, in a court of justice ought to be believed and have weight, then, upon the same principles, it ought to receive our entire credit here. Okay, so it's the same standards everywhere, across the board. But if, on the other hand, we should be justified in rejecting it, then, supposing our rules of evidence to be sound, we may be excused if we hesitate elsewhere to give it credence. In other words, if we're going to reject evidence or testimony regarding the Bible, we must also do the same in a court of law. And I don't know of anyone who seriously believes that if they were charged with some crime, that they should be, that the court should be done in a sloppy or careless manner. We've often heard of course, cases being thrown out of court on the basis of flawed proceedings, and this would also be true of any claim against the Bible. If the Bible is to be charged guilty of something, then the person making that charge is not to be taken seriously if they have not taken the examination seriously. Now he's narrowing his point again here when he says that the proof that God has revealed himself to man by special and express communications, that is to say the Bible, and that Christianity constitute that revelation, is no part of these inquiries. This has already been shown. And he goes on to say, read another book if you want to branch out into a more general topic. So he also claims that man is a religious being, is universally conceded, for it has been seen to be universally true. He is everywhere a worshiper, in every age and country, in every stage, from the highest intellectual culture to the darkest stupidity. He bows with homage to a superior being, be it the rude carved idol of his own fabrication, or the unseen divinity that stirs within him. It is still the object of his adoration. This trait in the character of man is so uniform that it may be safely assumed either as one of the original attributes of his nature or as necessarily resulting from the action of one or more of those attributes. So he's saying you can't lightly dismiss the fact that people around the world and throughout history have been mostly, it seems, bent toward religious belief. Regardless of how much sense it may make, or such as bowing to an idol that a person carved with their own hands, or that which is unseen. And in some people's minds, these are equivalent; they are equally absurd. But here again, this is prejudice and ignoring the fact that there's got to be something to this habit of people to look above themselves to a higher power, because it is so pervasive. In other words, the claim of atheism, which is that there is no God, not simply that they don't believe so, that they're claiming, no, there is no God, that is a positive claim. And I've gone into this in articles on my website, and I should have looked up a link, I didn't think of it till just now, on exactly what the definition of atheist is, and it is a claim, and is as such, it is up to them to bear the burden of proof, to claim that no God exists. And this is an impossible claim to prove, and therefore atheism is irrational, but that's a different topic. At any rate, the point being made here by Simon Greenleaf is that it is foolhardy to dismiss the fact that there must be something to this habit of humanity of looking above, that there is something more going on in this life than just what we can sense. So, he then, after making that point, says the object of man's worship, whatever it is, will naturally be his standard of perfection. And he goes on to say about what character, that this has the effect, in most cases, to raise the character of a person who believes that they have something to live up to, a standard that is more than just opinion or whim, or following our intuition or our guts or whatever you want to call it. So even though, and this is an important point, even though a person may ascribe deity with these lofty qualities, it doesn't necessarily mean that a person who believes this is what they should live for actually carries it out. And this is not just a problem in Christianity or religion in general. There are a lot of people who have lofty principles in life but don't follow them, at least not perfectly. And we are all imperfect humans. You expect some amount of imperfection and failing to live up to our own standards wherever we got them. But some people routinely don't live up to those standards, and that's a different issue. So he's saying that it isn't inevitable that just because Christianity, the religion of our focus here, just because it has lofty principles and that many Christians don't live up to them perfectly, that doesn't invalidate the faith. Let's see. Let me skip down a little bit. So, and here's an interesting question he proposes then, that if God made man capable of religion and required it in order to develop the highest part of his nature without communicating with him as a father in those revelations, which alone could perfect that nature, would be a reproach upon God and a contradiction. In other words, if God demands high standards from us, it would be irrational and unconscionable for God not to tell us what those standards are. And this is what he is arguing the Bible is, an expression of God's standards for us. And God has every right to make those standards. Many people equate God with a parent and saying, well, how can a parent demand the worship of their children? Well, that analogy is not perfect. No analogy is. He isn't just like a parent. He is in many respects. But he is also our creator and our God. And you don't treat him the way you treat other created beings. And that's the whole, that's the root of a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions, is that God should be just like us. And that means we're bringing God down to our level and undeifying him, basically. We want him to be someone we can hold to account the same way we would hold each other to account, and this is not accurate. This is not rational. The Creator is not to be held in judgment by his creations. That is to say, he's God and he sets the standards for us. Okay, his standards are much higher for himself, and just because they don't match what we think he should do and what he told us to do doesn't mean that he's hypocritical or anything, because he's a different class of being, just in the same way that we make rules for our pets that we don't make for our children, and we make rules for pets that we wouldn't make for any human being, even our equal adults, because pets are a different class of being, and they are dependent upon us for their well-being. And so we may have a fence around our backyard for their safety. They think of it, maybe if they think of it at all, as a limitation and us being unfair and not letting them roam free, when in fact we know that if they roamed free, they would probably be killed in short order. And in the same way, there are spiritual entities in existence that are very malevolent and would tear us apart if we went beyond the boundaries that God has set. So God has the right to set those boundaries. And it is not our place to tell him he should not set those boundaries, because we are not all knowing as he is, and so there has to be a certain amount of trust, just as a pet should trust its owner, for its own good. And here again, we're not talking about one human telling another human to obey them and it's for their own good. Human beings are flawed. We know it because we're one of them. But God is not a human being. So anyway, that's what I got out of what he's saying there in that document. Then he goes on with some history of why he thought various religious beliefs arose. And then we'll skip down here more about why people invented deities or why they behaved a certain way. Then he reaches down to the point where he argues all of that, and you can read how he arrived at his conclusion that the Creator had prepared, as he says here in the last few lines, prepared a people to receive the perfect revelation of the character of God, or the nature of his worship and of the way of restoration to his image and favor. This was also expressly revealed by the mission of his Son. So he's giving background leading up to why he believes that God sent Jesus to do these things. But he accepts the genuineness of the Old Testament and all of this. And once again, this is after he had become a Christian, having been hostile to it beforehand. So he examines, as from a legal aspect, why he believes that the documents are accurate. And we'll skip through that down to another legal principle, which I think is probably important in a document like this. That in matters of public and general interest, all persons must be presumed to be conversant on the principle that individuals are presumed to be conversant with their own affairs. That is to say, a person of acceptable rationality, sound mind, whatever the term may be. And we often, hear of people having their sanity questioned before a trial so that they're deemed fit to stand trial. And he is saying that he believes that the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are indeed fit to stand trial. And he will go on to say examine their character, as I mentioned at the start. So he says, in such matters, the prevailing current of assertion, the point he's making, is resorted to as evidence, for it is to this that every member of the community is supposed to be privy. That is to say, everyone involved in the trial, so to speak, is being apprised of all the facts and the backgrounds and all that. Let's see, and then as in the case of officials and other public books, not necessary that they should be confirmed and sanctioned by the ordinary tests of truth. If any ancient document concerning our public rights were lost copies which have been received in evidence into any of our courts of justice, the entire text of the document he mentions is received authority in all the courts. In other words, it isn't necessary in every point that we may put under examination to reestablish the validity of the documents we're going to appeal to. And I've done that in earlier video, plus also this page of a whole bunch of links on the documents themselves. So, and he goes on and skip down a little bit. Supposing, therefore, it is not irrational nor inconsistent with sound philosophy to believe that God has made a special and express revelation of his character and will, and that the sacred books of our religion are genuine, as we now have them, we proceed. He's just saying, this isn't the time or place to question the validity of the documents, what we're going to do here is look at what they themselves say, the Gospels themselves, and cross-examine them with each other and with a few other external references, as we'll find out later. Our attention will naturally be first directed to the witnesses themselves to see who and what manner of men they were, and we shall take them in the order of their writings, stating the prominent traits only in their lives and characters as they are handed down to us by credible historians. Now here he's going to go on and say a little bit about Matthew, who Matthew was. He was also called Levi, a Jew of Galilee. He held the place of a publican or tax gatherer under the Roman government, and his office seems to have consisted in collecting taxes within his district. While engaged in this business, I'm skipping a little bit, at the office of collection, he was required by Jesus to follow him as one of his disciples, a command he immediately obeyed. Soon afterwards, he appears to have been given a great entertainment to his fellow tax collectors, at which Jesus was present, intending to and he probably did this, he's saying, to advertise the fact that he had changed and to give them an opportunity to profit by the teaching of his new master. He was constituted one of the 12 apostles and constantly attended the person of Jesus as a faithful follower until the crucifixion and after the ascension of his master. He preached the gospel for some time with other apostles in Judea and afterwards in Ethiopia, where he died. He is generally allowed to have written first, which is accepted, not given permission, but accepted as having written the first or earliest account. But whether in the Hebrew or the Greek language or both, the scholars are not in agreement. And it doesn't matter to his purpose to inquire the genuineness of our present Greek gospel being sustained by satisfactory evidence. So it doesn't matter in this examination whether the original was in Hebrew, or he doesn't mention Aramaic or Greek. The fact is that the Greek is what we have as the earliest document, and we're going to go with that. The precise time he wrote is uncertain, the several dates, and this may be, some of this may be a little outdated information because, as I said, this was written quite a while ago, and I did not look those up ahead of time, so I may or may not be supportive of the dates he's asserting here, but we'll go with this for now, varying from AD 37 to AD 64. The earlier date, however, is argued with greater force from the improbability that the Christians would be left for several years without a general and authentic history of our Savior's ministry. Let's skip a little bit here, and he mentions that certain people were still of the Roman government officials were still in power, and that Pilate was still governor of Judea. If you even look at something like Wikipedia, which, regardless of its lack of reliability, is certainly not the kind of website that would be supportive of Christianity, so they have, as many have asserted, whether Christian or not, a liberal bias, that they would concede that Jesus was put to death by Pontius Pilate is something to consider. So in other words, I would consider Wiki a hostile witness, and they are conceding a certain fact of Jesus' life. So whether Jesus existed is really not in question anymore, and you can read the Wiki article on that, or any other article on that, and don't just read one, and don't just read the ones that support your preconceived conclusions. If you want to find out whether Jesus existed, do a thorough examination, because this is kind of a big deal. That Matthew, he goes on, was himself a native Jew, familiar with the opinion, ceremonies, and customs of his countrymen, that he was familiar with the sacred writings, that is to say the Old Testament as we call it now, and familiar with his expressions or idioms, a man of plain sense but little learning, except as what he derived from the scriptures of the Old Testament. That is to say, he was not highly educated, but not stupid either, especially. I mean, he did have an official position. That he wrote seriously and from conviction, and had on most occasions been present and attended closely to the transactions which he relates, without any applause to himself. In other words, Matthew is a first-hand witness and is not writing in order to make himself look better. Okay, and that's an important thing to note about his character. It is deemed equally well proved, he goes on, both by internal evidence and the aid of history, that he wrote for the use of his countrymen, the Jews. And this is pretty much indisputable. People don't realize that the four Gospels were written from four different perspectives of the same incident, just as you might have witnesses to a car accident at an intersection from people at all four corners. They will see things slightly differently. They also saw the same event, and any investigator asking for the testimonies of these eyewitnesses would be suspicious of collusion if they all gave the exact same account. So we should expect some differences, although not contradictory evidence, when we examine the four Gospels. Okay, so at any rate, Matthew's perspective was to write to his countrymen, the Jews. And so he makes every reference he can to the Old Testament and to them as a people. So that's why he emphasized certain things, added things that others didn't, left out things that others added, and so forth. He is the one where we read most about the lineage of the Messiah from David, born in Bethlehem, and the circumstances of fulfilled prophecy. So they've already talked about the fact that he was a tax collector, and he wants to spend more time on that in explaining what it meant to be a Roman tax collector. That is to say, not a Roman by birth, but someone working for Rome or acting on behalf of Rome. At any rate, that's not important to the point I want to make today, which is just about how this Simon Greenleaf is establishing the character of the witnesses. Okay. So he says, I will highlight this bit at the end, Matthew must have been familiar with a great variety of forms of fraud, being a tax collector, and deception of all kinds, and must have become in the habit of distrusting and scrutinizing and being cautious of people, and would be unlikely to be deceived in this regard in many of the facts of Jesus' ministry. So in other words, he's saying Matthew was street smart. Matthew would not have been gullible to someone coming along and telling him things. You know, he's used to people trying to cheat him, or cheat Rome as it may be. So he was, on the streets with people, so he wouldn't have been a gullible government bureaucrat. He was hands-on. Okay, so this circumstance, the article goes on to say, shows the sincerity and the wisdom of Jesus in selecting him for an eyewitness of his conduct, and adds great weight to the value of the testimony of this evangelist. So Matthew is established as a credible witness of good character because he would not have been easily fooled by Jesus, and he would have been naturally suspicious of him and familiar with the ways of fraud. And so this person, also being familiar with the scriptures, he had a lot of qualities that qualified him, that would make him someone Jesus would recruit. Now he goes on to Mark. He was the son of a pious sister of Barnabas named Mary, who dwelt at Jerusalem and whose house the early Christians often assembled. His Hebrew name was John. The surname of Mark, that's his last name, having been adopted, as is supposed, when he left Judea, apologize for the barking dogs, to preach the gospel in foreign countries. It was not unusual among the Jews of that age, who frequently assumed a name more familiar than their own for the people to whom they visited. So he was adopting a surname, as if to say John Mark was his name, so as to relate to the people he visited and traveled to. He is supposed to have been converted to the Christian faith by the ministry of Peter. So Mark is not an eyewitness, but he is the very close to Peter, one of the inner circle of Jesus' disciples. He traveled to from Jerusalem to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, and these two were, Paul was a secondary in some ways, but a primary in others witness of Jesus, because Jesus did in fact appear to him. So he's a kind of a unique case. But Mark traveled with these people, and so he knew a lot about all of the events of Jesus' life. And And he mentions here, this is the John Mark that Paul had a falling out with over Mark's failing to continue with them on the trip. Okay, so here we have a little rift, but not a serious one on doctrine. It's just that Paul felt that John Mark should not have turned back at that point in his missionary travels, but that's irrelevant to our point today. But maybe it says something about his character, so that's why it's being mentioned here. They separated, and Barnabas took Mark with him to Cyprus, and then other travels in here, and such is the outline of Mark's history as it is furnished by the New Testament. The early historians add that after this he went into Egypt and planted a church in Alexandria, where he died. It is agreed that Mark wrote his gospel for the use of Gentile converts, as opposed to Matthew, who wrote for the Jews. So Mark is writing to the Gentiles, the converts, and he put things in it which, as the writer says here, would have been useless to a Jew, and that it was composed for those at Rome is believed not only from the numerous Latinisms, or Latin expressions it contains, but from the unanimous testimony of ancient writers and from the internal evidence afforded by the gospel itself. So Mark's perspective is from the Gentiles, whereas Matthew's was from the Jewish perspective. So we have two of our four perspectives here on the life of Jesus. And this one is aimed at the Gentiles. He goes on, some have entertained the opinion that Mark compiled his account from that of Matthew, and this notion has been refuted by Knopp, whoever this is, some scholar evidently, and others, now generally regarded as untenable. So if someone is still touting the idea, and this is, keep in mind, was written over 100 years ago, if someone is still touting the idea that Mark compiled his account from Matthew, this is outdated information. Okay? Mark frequently deviates from Matthew in the order of time, his arrangement of facts, and he adds many things not related by the other evangelists, neither of which a mere epitomizer, or someone trying to just cobble things together, would probably have done. He also omits several things related by Matthew and perfectly describes others, especially the transaction of Christ with the apostles, transactions being interactions, we might say today, with the apostles after the resurrection, giving no account whatever of his appearance in Galilee. Omissions irreconcilable with any previous knowledge of the gospel according to Matthew. So in other words, he's saying that the things that Mark left out or got possibly in error indicate the genuineness of his writing as his own and not a cobbled together, plagiarism version of Matthew. And the fact is that since Mark was not a primary witness, that we would expect this sort of thing, and this adds to its genuineness, not detracts from it. Going on to these proofs, we may add that in several places there are discrepancies between the account of Matthew and Mark, not irreconcilable, but sufficient to destroy the probability that the latter copied from the former. And if he's referring to the accounts of the crucifixion, the trial, and all that, I have documents on that I've done some study on that clear up a lot of those supposed difficulties. The striking coincidences between them, that is to say Matthew and Mark, in style, words, and things in other places, may be accounted for by considering Peter, who is supposed to have dictated this gospel to Mark, was quite as intimately acquainted as Matthew with the miracles and discourses of our Lord, which therefore he would naturally recite in his preaching, and that the same things might naturally be related in the same manner. So, saying not that by excellency of speech, meaning he's not trying to use big words to fool anybody. Peter's agency in the narrative of Mark is asserted by all ancient writers. In other words, it's Peter, not Matthew, which Mark is getting his information from, and confirmed by the fact that his humility is conspicuous in every part of it. He exposes his own frailties and weaknesses, Mark does. So, here again, we have a mark of authenticity, and genuineness, and reporting the facts rather than his own narrative. Okay, so this is how you examine someone's character. If Mark is to be accused of being a plagiarist and a fake, and writing a fictional history, then he did a really bad job of it. Okay? And in addition, the flip side of this is that while at the same time that he left out things that could have made him look, that he didn't leave out things that made him look bad, he also did not include things that could have made him look better. So now we're going to look at Luke, who, according to Eusebius, another historical figure, was a native of Antioch and a physician. He was a doctor. And at one point he traveled with Paul, probably as his personal physician. From the casual notices of him in scriptures and from the earlier Christian writers, it has extra biblical evidence here, early Christian writers, been collected that his parents were Gentiles, but he in his youth embraced Judaism, from which he was converted to Christianity. The first mention of him is that he was when he was with Paul at Troas, whereas he appears to have attended him to Jerusalem. Oh, from whence? Whence means from where. From where he appears to have attended to him to Jerusalem. In other words, Troas is where he met up with Paul and then traveled with him from there. So this is when it comes to a little side note here of people who dismiss Paul as a false teacher, they have to remember that this Luke, who wrote one of the Gospels, is also the historian that wrote the book of Acts, which is where he recorded the travels of Paul. So if they dismiss anything to do with Paul, they have to also dismiss Luke, who said nothing bad about Paul as far as him being a false apostle or anything like that. So you have to dismiss Luke as well. So in other words, if you dismiss Paul, you have to pretty much dismiss a vast majority of the New Testament. At any rate, Luke traveled with Paul, and he says at the end of this paragraph that none of the ancient writers mention his having suffered martyrdom, so it is believed that he died a natural death. Like Mark, Luke wrote his gospel for the benefit of Gentile converts, and that this is affirmed by unanimous voice of Christian antiquity, and that means ancient Christian writers outside of the Bible, and it may be also inferred from his dedication to a Gentile. He is particularly careful to specify various circumstances conducive to the information of strangers. In other words, he's trying to explain things that the Jews were doing to a Gentile audience. This is the same deal with the fact that when you're trying to figure out what language the things were originally written in. When someone in the Greek text says, which being translated means such and such, it's after they've given an Aramaic or Hebrew word. We know that the writing was in Greek originally, because he's translating. Okay, he's translating for the Greek reader as he writes. So, at any rate, this is something of particular note in the way Luke is writing. He's careful to specify various circumstances, to explain things to strangers, but not so to the Jews. He gives the lineage of Jesus upwards after the manner of the Gentiles, instead of downwards, as Matthew had done, tracing it up to Adam, and thus showing that Jesus was the promised seed of the woman. In other words, when we have the two genealogies in the Bible, in the Gospels, some people think it's a contradiction, but they have two different perspectives and two different audiences. One being to the Jews and starting from ancient times down to the present, whereas Luke is doing the opposite, because that's the manner that Gentiles expect. They expect you to start with the person you're talking about and trace your way back. And so that's another topic, but that he's explaining why Luke wrote it this way. He also mentions the timing of Jesus' birth and so forth by the reigns of Roman emperors. Okay, and if the Jews wouldn't care so much about that, but even if they would, it's a part of the whole package here of where Luke is coming from, that he writes his dates and things in accordance with the timing of Roman emperors, or not just emperors, but rulers of Rome. of whatever level. Introduces several things not mentioned by the other evangelists, but highly encouraging to the Gentiles to turn to God in the hope of pardon and acceptance. Excuse me. These include the parables of the publican and the Pharisee in the temple. You can read about that, where one is, the self-righteous religious leader and the other is a street person. And Jesus notes that the street person, the publican, is much more righteous in the eyes of God because of his heartfelt repentance, whereas the Pharisee was praying very proudly. On the lost piece of silver, the prodigal son, and Jesus' visit to Zacchaeus, who was a publican, a tax collector like Matthew, and a pardon of the repentant thief, penitent. That's a word that everybody knows now because of Indiana Jones movie, where it was the third one, where they're looking for the Holy Grail, and he says only the penitent man will pass. And anyway, that penitent means that you're on, he kneels, he's lowly, and that sort of thing. These are given as examples of why Luke is writing what he's writing and what he includes and doesn't include. Luke was a physician, appears only from the testimony of Paul, not only from the testimony of Paul, but from the internal marks in his gospel, showing that he was both an acute observer and had given particular and even professional attention to all the Savior's miracles of healing. Thus, the man whom Matthew and Mark describe simply as a leper, Luke describes as full of leprosy. One with a withered hand that the others mention, Luke says had his right hand withered. Of the maid that the others say Jesus took her spirit, came to her again. It's kind of awkwardly worded there, but what he's saying, there was an account where Jesus took the hand of a young girl who had died and she came back to life. The other gospel writers don't describe much about it, but Luke, with professional accuracy of observation, says that virtue went out of Jesus, or power, you might say today, and healed the sick. He alone states the fact that the sleep of the disciples in Gethsemane was induced by extreme sorrow. So, and then he is the one who mentions the blood-like sweat of Jesus as occasioned by the intensity of his agony, and he alone relates the miraculous healing of Malchus's ear. So, in other words, Luke shows by his writing and his attention to detail, especially to do with healing, that he was in fact a physician. His gospel was written to correct the others, in other words, to supersede the defective and inaccurate narratives then in circulation. Not necessarily the Gospels, but there may have been other snippets of writings in circulation before they were formally and completely done. And so Luke, as he states in the beginning of his writing, that he's setting out to write a very thorough and methodical account of all this, and to deliver to someone named Theophilus, as it shows here. And this is a direct quote from the writings of Luke, the Gospel, where he says who he's writing to and why. Scholars are not in agreement on who this person was, but the most probable opinion is that Luke wrote his Gospel in Greece, and Theophilus was a man of rank in that country. So in other words, he had a benefactor who wanted to know the truth, who was hearing this and that and the other, and he wanted a full account, so he hired Luke to do the job. Luke is describes as having a perfect understanding of all these things from the first, so that he was a first-hand witness as regards to the, being not, I shouldn't say a witness, but an investigator, a very good investigator. He does not affirm himself to have been an eyewitness, though his personal knowledge of some of the transactions may well be inferred from the perfect understanding he says he possessed. So if he did not write from his own personal knowledge, the question is, what is the legal character of his not everyone who investigates a crime is an eyewitness to a crime. In fact, that would be extremely rare. Most of the time, the reason people go to court is because there isn't a direct witness to every bit of the incident, and so you have to have a lot of people come to the witness stand and give their testimony. And so this is what he's saying Luke is doing, okay? And he is an investigator of first quality. And so he would be accepted by any court of law as a good witness, or not so much a witness, I keep using the terms, I'm thinking of the others, but a good investigator because of the thoroughness of his work. Let me skip down here a little bit. So he is establishing the case that Luke is a reliable witness in the sense of being one of the four evangelists. So, and it's possible that he had a lot of things that he did witness himself, but not all of it. So now we come to John, the last of the evangelists, the son of Zebedee, a fisherman. His father appears to have been a respectable man in his calling, owning his own vessel or boat, and having hired servants. So this was a businessman. John's father was a businessman, a successful fisherman. His mother also followed Jesus and ministered unto him, which means, helped him out a lot. It says in one of the other, I think this gospel or one of the other ones, where they say that there were a large number of women that went also along with Jesus everywhere he went, and some of them were benefactors, and it's to say they provided money and help for him to live on. To John himself, Jesus was one of the only male that stayed around for till the bitter end when Jesus died. The rest of the disciples took off, but the women stuck around, and John stuck around. And because of that, and John was, by the way, the youngest disciple, that Jesus, was, as the oldest son in his family, was obligated to settle his affairs before he died, and so he passes the responsibility for the care of his mother to his apostle or disciple John. John also was known to the high priest at the time and to have influence in his family, so he had the privilege of being present in his palace at the examination of his master, meaning when Jesus was being put on trial illegally, and of introducing also Peter. He was the youngest of the apostles, was eminently the object of the Lord's regard and confidence. In other words, he was probably his best buddy, described as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And there's people who are going to twist that, but what it means is they were the best of friends. And he loved him like a son almost, because he was probably a fair amount younger than he. But at any rate, he was an eyewitness who was present at many of the scenes, to which others were not admitted because of his being known to the high priest. He alone, in the company with Peter and James, was present at the resurrection of Jairus' daughter. That is one of the people that Jesus raised from the dead. Also at the Transfiguration on the Mount, which is another event in the scriptures where Jesus took his inner circle up to the top of the mountain, and at that time he was transformed into his divine form and accompanied by Moses and Elijah for a moment, and they all talked among each other. And so John was present at that event. And of course at the agony, which is the crucifixion. Also in the Garden of Gethsemane. This was a little editing problem here, but he's saying that there shouldn't be a period here at the end of the sentence. He's saying at the agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, in other words, when Jesus was sweating these, so bad it looked like drops of blood coming off of him, and then he was the only apostle who followed Jesus to the cross, the only male apostle, it is to say, the only one of the 12. He was the first one at the tomb, the first of them, meaning the apostles, because the women got there before any of the apostles. And he was present at the several appearances of Jesus after his resurrection. So, these circumstances and his friendship with Jesus' mother and the high priest and all that give him a circumstantial and authentic account of the life of his master. So, in other words, John was eminently qualified as an eyewitness. And it says that from history we learn afterwards, after the death of Jesus' mother Mary, John, proceeded to Asia Minor, where he founded and presided over 7 churches in as many cities, but resided chiefly at Ephesus. From there, which that's the meaning of thence, from there he was banished in Domitian's reign, but Domitian being the Roman emperor, to the Isle of Patmos, where he wrote his Revelation. This is the John who wrote the book of Revelation. Okay, and he wrote it while in exile at the command of Domitian, and this helps us to date the writing of Revelation to around AD 95, which is after AD 70, when Jerusalem fell. And that's a big deal when you study Bible prophecy, and I may do that next, I'm not sure, but the fact of when John was exiled is a big deal in determining when Revelation was given. And so when, Revelation could not have been talking about events that had passed. In other words, if they're looking to talking about what's going to happen to the temple, and the temple had already been destroyed, then there must be another temple to come, and it was quite literal. On the ascension of Nerva, which is, rising another Roman emperor, that is to say, not ascension from the dead, but ascension in the ranks, John was freed from exile and returned to Ephesus, where he wrote his gospel and epistles, and died at the age of 100 years, about AD 100, in the 3rd year of the Emperor Trajan. So, by that, if that age is correct, then he really wasn't that much younger than Jesus. It's just that he was the youngest of the apostles. So, I guess you could say that Jesus loved him more, not so much as a son, but a brother, more like that, best buddy, whatever. At any rate, this is the John who wrote Revelation. And the 7 churches, I'll have to check into that, but it may be that these are the same 7 churches that John wrote about, that Jesus told him to write to while he was exiled on Patmos and getting the revelation given to him. So I'll have to look into that, but as I said, it wouldn't surprise me to learn that this is one of the reasons those 7 churches were chosen. It's because those were the churches that John himself had founded. Scholars not agreed as the time the Gospel of John was written, some early as AD 68, others as late as 98, but is generally conceded to have been written after all the others. In other words, this is chronologically the last Gospel to be written. That is, it could not have been the work of some Platonic Christian of a subsequent age, as some have without evidence asserted, because earlier writings by Christian writers reference it, and so we know that this was, the later date is probably not, most assuredly not true, because you can't have people referring to a writing before it was made. So because we have these early references, we know that it was written much earlier than some critics assert. Now, the purpose to the writing was either with a special reference to the Gentiles, or at a time when many of them had become converts to Christianity, is inferred from the various explanation it contains beyond the other Gospels, which would only have been necessary to persons unacquainted with Jewish names and customs. That it was written after all the others and to supply their omissions is concluded not only from the uniform tradition and belief in the church, but also from his studied omission of most of the transaction noticed by the others. So in other words, he's saying John left out a lot of things because they'd already been written by the others, so why reinvent the wheel? Why repeat it? He was not competing with them, he was augmenting their writings. So he mentioned events which were known only to him, that this is indisputable, and he had no need to repeat what had already been stated. So this is the background of the 4 gospel writers. Okay, so their character is established, their motive is established, their qualification is established, and if you remember that the statement at the beginning, that these are the points that were determined before the investigation began that should determine whether these were reliable witnesses. Okay? So, establishing the character of the four gospel writers is why we can rely on their testimony. Okay, and there's no reason to reject that testimony other than people saying that that just must not be so, and they assume their motives without really taking the time to investigate these facts about these people. They want them to be false. They want these people to have been liars, and so they look up people who will tell them this and present what seems to be evidence without even really asking enough questions, as if to say it's okay with them to run a kangaroo court or a sloppy trial, a mistrial, and they're happy with that, and they conclude what they wanted to conclude all along. But when you do an investigation like this about the character of the witnesses, then you have a problem with the assertion that they were liars or mistaken or incompetent or something like that. So, he says, a proposition of fact is proved when its truth is established by competent and satisfactory evidence. By competent evidence, such as the nature of thing requires, by satisfactory evidence is meant that the amount of proof which ordinarily satisfies an unprejudiced mind beyond any reasonable doubt. So, what he's saying here is by the same criteria you would use, if you use any at all, to determine any other fact should be used for the Bible and the resurrection of Jesus. And, and this begins with the examination of the witnesses, which has been done. So then the next step is going to be to examine what they said and compare what they said, and we've done a little bit of that already, but in general terms, but not specifics. He says that when we have this degree of evidence, it is unreasonable to require more. A juror would violate his oath if he should refuse to acquit or condemn a person charged with an offense where this measure of proof was adduced, which in other words means that given the support of the witnesses and the evidence they present, to reject it anyway is a mistrial. It is dereliction of duty of the jurors. So you, if, as a Bible critic, for example, are a juror or looking at the evidence, and if you dismiss it all just because you don't like it, then you're a poor juror and have not participated in a fair trial. So now he's saying what the next step is going to be, and that how important it was to establish the credibility of the witnesses. And in the absence, he says, of circumstances which generate suspicion, every witness is presumed to be credible until the contrary is shown. The burden of impeaching his credibility lying on the objector. In other words, if people want to say these gospel writers were liars or incompetent, or simply wanting to make up a story that supported someone they liked, a teacher they followed, the critic has the burden of proof because they are arguing from silence. Everything that we do know about these people is supporting them as people of sound mind, character, reliability, and competence. And so these are credible witnesses, and until you can prove otherwise, you can't just assert it. Okay, so by any rational means, the gospel writers are established as credible witnesses. This rule, as he says, serves to show the injustice with which the writers of the Gospels have ever been treated by infidels, an injustice silently acquiesced and even by Christians, in requiring the Christian affirmatively and by positive evidence to establish the credibility of his witnesses above all others, before their testimony is entitled to be considered, and in permitting the testimony of a single profane writer, alone and uncorroborated, to outweigh that of any single Christian. In other words, a person may have, 99 proofs in favor of something, but they find one against and decide that, okay, this disproves all the other 99. That's what happens when people find a snippet of the Gospel of Thomas or, some other Gnostic writing or scrap of paper from history and say, I found one thing that contradicts it, therefore all the 99 other proofs are dismissed. This is stupidity. This is not a rational or scientific investigation. This is an injustice, in fact. So if someone was trying to find out whether Jesus rose from the dead, they have to understand what it means to have the preponderance of evidence, and that is in favor of the Bible, not against it. That is where the evidence lies. We have a lot of positive evidence for the Bible, very little negative, and if any one of you critics were on trial and were deemed guilty on the basis of one contrary opinion, you would be outraged. And so should every Christian, and we are often our own worst enemies in this regard because we don't think about these things. He goes on to say, the testimony of a single witness is never permitted to outweigh the oath even of the defendant himself, interested as he is in the cause. But on the contrary, if the plaintiff, after having required the oath of his adversary, cannot overthrow it by something more than the oath of one witness, however credible, it must stand as evidence against him. And going on, he says, the Christian writer seems by the usual course of the argument to have been deprived of the common presumption of charity in his favor, and reversing the ordinary rule of administering justice in human tribunals. His testimony is unjustly presumed to be false until it is proved to be true. This treatment, moreover, has been applied to them all in a body, and without due regard to the fact that, being independent historians, the writing at different periods, they are entitled to the support of each other. They have been treated in the argument almost as if the New Testament were the entire production, at once, of a body of men, conspiring by a joint fabrication to impose a false religion upon the world. It is time that this injustice should cease, that the testimony of the evangelists should be admitted to be true, until it can be disproved by those who would impugn it, that is to say, would trash talk it, or dispute it. That the silence of one sacred writer on any point should no more detract from his own veracity or truth, or that of the other historians, than the like circumstance is permitted to do among profane writers, profane being secular, I guess you could say, is an equivalent word today, and that the four evangelists should be admitted in corroboration of each other as readily as Josephus and Tacitus, or Polybius and Livy, or Livy, depending on how you want to pronounce that. So he's saying this whole paragraph is an excellent scathing rebuttal to those who would would just overturn every normal rule of determining something to be true or false just because it's the Bible and they don't like what it says. It's the same with science. When there's a scientific method states that you must observe and repeat, and yet this is abandoned in the theory of evolution because we're talking about past events that were unobserved and cannot be repeated. And so the scientific method is absolutely abandoned, yet is considered unscientific theory. In the same way, and that's philosophically a logical fallacy called special pleading. You can look that up, special pleading. This is exactly what's happening here with the Gospels. People can use good methods of investigation of any past event, such as a crime, but abandon all those principles when they come to the Bible. So I would encourage you to read that again. I put it into the description, this whole paragraph, that people are hypocritical and using a double standard and engaging in the fallacy of special pleading when they engage in this sort of thing, where they throw out the vast majority, the preponderance of evidence in favor of the Bible, in favor of a few, what you might call a minority report of things that in any court of law they would be outraged if this was used to condemn them. So, if the burden of establishing the credibility of the evangelists were devolved on those who affirm the truth of their narratives is still capable of a ready moral demonstration. They repeat themselves sometimes in here. I think this is not the original writing, but someone who put it online. When we consider the nature and character of the testimony and essential marks of difference between true narratives of facts and the creation of falsehoods, that is to say, the people at the four corners observing an intersection accident, you would expect some differences, but not conflicting differences. And if there were no differences, you would suspect that the four people who witnessed the event got together, put their heads together, and made up a story. So these differences in the Gospels are positive testimony, not negative. So, this led up to the statement that I put at the first, that about these 5 criteria for establishing a witness. And he says, let the evangelists be tried by these tests, which means you put them on trial on the basis of these tests, and they come out clean as credible witnesses. Then he goes on to talk about their honesty, and each one of those points, their character, and goes into a great deal about that. So let's try and get to the point of what difference does it make whether these were credible witnesses. Okay? And we should remember that these are ancient writings we're dealing with, and that people will gladly and blindly accept any other ancient writing on its face, but when it comes to the Bible, for some reason, they have to do the special pleading fallacy again and say that, oh, this is an ancient writing, it must be false, and they scrutinize it and put it under the microscope as they do no other ancient writing. But we should remember, he says here, that very little of the literature of the times and country has come down to us, that the collateral sources and means of corroborating, explaining their writings are proportionally limited. So we don't have as much to go on as we'd like, but by the same standards used of any other ancient writing, we have quite a bit. The essential marks of difference between true narratives and fictions have been adverted to, that these attributes are strikingly apparent in the Gospels, and the absence of all the others equally remarkable. So, once again, he's establishing the rationality of the content of the Gospels as being as well established as anything else. In other words, if you reject the content of the Gospels, you have to reject all the content of every other ancient document and every other past event by the same criteria. So in other words, this is well established as anything. He goes on to quote someone named Dr. Chalmers, had the evangelists been false historians, they would not have committed themselves upon so many particulars. In other words, the preponderance of details, the volume of details that the gospel writers give is not what you would want if you were trying to fool somebody, because too much of what you say can be checked out. And then he goes on to say in detail what they wrote that would have been to their disadvantage if they were making up a story. So they go on to talk about the specifics then of the details concerning Jesus' trial and execution, and the testimony of his hostile witnesses. This is a big deal in any court of law. If you have hostile witnesses, they're going to look for holes in your testimony and expose any falsehoods you may be saying. So the fact that we have hostile witnesses who actually support the events that the gospel writers are talking about is a really big deal, and something that any impartial jury would consider as supporting the evidence that the gospel writers are presenting. So, as I said, even Wikipedia admits that Jesus was put on trial by Pontius Pilate, and so here again we have a positive match to the Bible. And for someone to claim that just because it matches a few things doesn't mean that everything is true, while that's logically true, the evidence in a court of law, if you put yourself once again in the shoes of the one on trial, you would say, no, I can't prove absolutely everything I say, but the parts that are examinable have all been true so far, so why would you convict me on the basis of an argument from silence? And that's what people do when they say, just because everything we've seen so far in the Bible matches the truth doesn't mean that all of it does. This is a ridiculous argument, and one that would have you fuming if it was applied to you in a court of law. They go on in this article to, well, this is, Simon Greenleaf's writing, that there are other internal marks of truth in the narratives of the evangelists, that he won't go into detail, and that overall these accounts are written in a matter-of-fact manner. They are not moral teachings unless they're quoting Jesus' moral teachings. And he has he is convinced that their moral character is exemplary, and that the person they're talking about has exemplary character as well, that being Jesus. So these credible witnesses have described Jesus as being the Son of God, who came down in human form, born of a virgin, lived a perfect sinless life, fulfilled the law through the letter, was put on trial unjustly, and suffered and died as an innocent victim, and then who rose from the dead 3 days later. These are credible witnesses saying these things. And there's at least 4 of them saying these things from different perspectives to different audiences. And so if credible witnesses tell you, it's just like today, if somebody says, I saw a UFO, in the times past it's been fashionable to write these people off as lunatics or jokesters. But now this has happened to so many people so many times that people are finally accepting it as some real thing that happens. In the same way, and these are rational people a lot of times, police officers or, not to say that they're necessarily rational people, I'm just saying that they are not, bums on the street or anything like that, that there are people such as, sea captains or business people or anyone who, a tradesperson, real people, okay? People that other people know and know to be rational and sane. And if they say, I saw a UFO, instead of writing them off as a crackpot, now people are finally realizing that sane people don't say one crazy thing and that makes them crazy completely. In the same way, we have these 4 gospel writers who are talking about something that sounds crazy, but their character is established and their facts are established about everything we can examine. So when we come to the part that people can't examine, that Jesus rose from the dead, all we have is the testimony of these reliable witnesses. What are you going to do? Again, put yourself in the place of the defendant on the witness stand. Would you accept that verdict of that you are guilty of what the critics are charging you with on the basis of an argument from silence? And so if you would not accept that, then don't perpetrate it. Don't be on the giving end of such a travesty of justice. So when these gospel writers tell you a whole bunch of rational things, and then one thing you consider irrational, are you going to condemn them on the basis of that one thing? Not if you're open-minded, and not if you're rational, in my opinion, and in the opinion of this legal expert. So, closing paragraph, the narratives of the evangelists are now submitted to the reader's perusal and examination upon the principles and by the rules already stated. For this purpose and for the sake of more ready and close comparison, they are arranged in juxtaposition, which means being compared and cross-examined after the general order of the latest and most approved harmonies, that being make sure we have the text right. The question is not upon the strict propriety of the arrangement, but upon the veracity or truthfulness of the witnesses and the credibility of their narratives. With the relative merits of modern harmonists, that is to say, people trying to put the whole thing together, and in fact, my commentary on the New Testament, I wrote a comprehensive commentary on all 4 Gospels at once and tried to put them together as best I could. That's what a harmonist does. So with the relative merits of modern harmonists and with the points of controversy among theologians, the writer has no concern. His business is that of a lawyer examining the testimony of witnesses by the rules of his profession, and he's talking about himself here, Simon Greenleaf, in order to ascertain whether, if they had thus testified on oath in a court of justice, they would be entitled to credit, and whether their narratives, as we now have them, would be received as ancient documents coming from the proper custody. If so, then it is believed that every honest and impartial person will act consistently with that result by receiving their testimony in all the extent of its import, and meaning considering the weight and importance of this trial, that if you are honest and impartial, you will act consistently with the verdict. By receiving their testimony, and to write out a full commentary or argument upon the text would be a useless addition to the bulk of the volume, but a few notes have been added for illustration of the narratives and for the clearing up of apparent discrepancies, as being all that members of the legal profession would desire. So in other words, and then they have a link here, I have not gone to this link, but we might as well go there. And I can't vouch for the content here, as this is a different writer and everything, but the point is there's a lot of material, a lot to learn about the trial of Jesus that most people, the vast majority, have not done. They have not examined this in detail. And on the basis of not having done so, they reach a verdict nonetheless, and would be outraged if they were treated the way they're treating Jesus and the resurrection and the gospel writers. So that's the point today of how a person should go about examining the life of Jesus and the claims of Jesus and his followers, and how much of a double standard it is when they do things to Jesus and the Bible and Christianity that they would never tolerate if they were done to themselves. So, as I said, maybe next time we'll get into the book of Revelation or something, I'm not sure. But I hope this all recorded, and if not, I will do a hangout. But hopefully this went off as I had planned, and everything showed up as it should. Everybody take care, and see you later.